EMV has been implemented in many countries around the world during the past 20 years. Each country has had its own unique challenges during its implementation. The goal of this presentation is to demystify one of the least understood components of the U.S. EMV migration, the U.S. Common Debit AIDs. By now, most people involved in the U.S. payments industry are aware that the Durbin Amendment to the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act had an impact to the routing of POS debit transactions. As you can see on the slide, the Durbin Amendment requires that there must be a choice between at least two unaffiliated networks when routing POS debit transactions. If you would like to read more about the Durbin Amendment, follow the link shown here. With the introduction of EMV, industry stakeholders still had to comply with the Durbin Amendment. In addition, industry stakeholders had to preserve the routing choices they have today. It's important to remember that the Durbin Amendment applies to transactions initiated by U.S.-issued cards at U.S. terminals. And the Durbin Amendment does not mention credit transactions or ATM transactions. However, as we will see throughout this presentation, both POS and ATM terminal owners have some changes to make in order to facilitate a choice between two unaffiliated networks when routing EMV debit transactions. In this presentation, we will focus on debit transactions and what changes with the introduction of EMV. Let's start with a quick review of what is on a magnetic stripe card today. Some of the card components, such as the organization name and logo, are consistent across all of the cards in a portfolio. Some cards are affiliated with a particular card brand or payment network. Some data is specific to an individual cardholder, such as the PAN and the cardholder name. The magnetic stripe on a card does not hold a lot of information, and the information it does contain is static. It does not change for the life of the card. Now let's take a look at the flow of a debit transaction in our familiar magnetic stripe world. Although the U.S. payments infrastructure is very complex, with many potential participants in a transaction, we will use a very simple example to illustrate our debit transaction. In this presentation, we will use the term POS acquirer or simply acquirer to represent the entity that is responsible for routing a transaction. The acquirer could be the merchant or an acquiring processor. We will also use the term issuer to represent the issuing institution or the issuer processor. The cardholder swipes the debit card, and the terminal captures tracked data from the magnetic stripe. The terminal formats a transaction request and sends it to the acquirer. The acquirer then makes a routing decision based on factors such as the BIN, which is the first few digits of the card number. As a result of the Durbin Amendment, a POS acquirer must be provided with a choice of at least two unaffiliated debit networks. In our example, the acquirer can choose between Network A and Network B. For various business reasons, let's say they choose to route this transaction to Network A. Eventually, the transaction request will reach the issuer, and the issuer will make their authorization decision. The issuer will generate a response and send it back to Network A. Network A will forward the response to the acquirer, and the acquirer will pass information to the terminal, such as whether the transaction was approved or declined. With the introduction of chip technology, a payment card will actually contain a microprocessor, which has many similarities to your PC or laptop. They both have hardware, and they both have an operating system. Your computer can support multiple applications, such as a word processor, browser, and photo editor. Each of these applications supports different types of files, which contain data. The chip on a chip card can also support multiple applications, although most U.S.-issued chip cards will initially only contain one application. Each application on the chip is represented by an application identifier, or AID. It is also possible for an application to be represented by more than one AID. This approach is used for the U.S. Common Debit AIDs, as we will see later in this presentation. Each application contains files with data that is referenced by the chip card and the terminal during an EMV transaction. A chip can hold a lot more information than a magnetic stripe. As we noted on the previous slide, for each application or AID on the chip, some specific information is required. This information can vary from one application to the next. For now, each U.S.-issued chip card will still have a magnetic stripe so that the card can be used at terminals throughout the world that do not yet support EMV. When we say Global AID in this presentation, we are referring to an AID that is owned by the global or international payment network whose logo is on the card. Global payment networks include American Express, Discover, MasterCard, and Visa. When a global AID is used for a transaction, generally the transaction must be routed to the associated global payment network. Let's look at an example of a chip card that contains only a global AID. When that global AID is selected for a debit transaction, generally the transaction must be routed to the global payment network that owns that AID. This does not comply with the Durbin Amendment requirement for the POS merchant or acquirer to have a choice of two unaffiliated networks for routing. How then, when we implement EMV, can we preserve the routing choices we have today and continue to comply with the Durbin Amendment? In addition, there are magnetic stripe cards in the market today that do not carry the brand of a global payment network. What applications and AIDs can these cards use? The Global Payment Networks and the EMV Migration Forum's Debit Working Committee looked at many possible solutions to these challenges. The result was the U.S. Debit EMV Technical Proposal, which describes the use of U.S. Common Debit AIDs. The link to the relevant white paper is shown here. This solution is compatible with a contactless transaction when implemented on a dual interface EMV chip card or a mobile device. However, contactless and mobile transactions are outside of the scope of this presentation. Refer to Addendum 1 of the U.S. Debit EMV Technical Proposal, version 1.3, for more information about contactless acceptance and the use of the U.S. Common Debit AIDs. The typical implementation of a contact debit chip card with a U.S. Common Debit AID, at least in the early phases of the U.S. EMV migration, will involve a card with two AIDs, a payment network-specific AID, which we will refer to as a global AID in this presentation, and a U.S. Common Debit AID. Currently, Discover, MasterCard, Visa, and some other global payment networks provide a U.S. Common Debit AID to be used on debit cards with their brand. American Express does not require dual routing. Therefore, American Express cards will utilize the American Express Global AID and will continue to route as they do today. For cards that do not support one of the global payment networks, a shared Debit AID can be licensed from the Debit Network Alliance. For more information about the Debit Network Alliance, refer to their website using the link shown here. A U.S.-issued branded debit chip card will typically contain a debit application from the global payment network. There will be two AIDs associated with this debit application, a global AID from that global payment network, and a U.S. Common Debit AID from that global payment network. Both AIDs will point to the same funding account. The global AID must be used outside of the U.S., since terminals outside of the U.S. will not support a U.S. Common Debit AID. The U.S. Common Debit AID can be used along with the global AID in the U.S. to facilitate routing choice. A U.S. issuer may license the shared Debit AID from the DNA for their debit network branded cards that do not support one of the global payment networks. This AID can be used with any debit application that meets the criteria specified by the DNA. At this time, no other AID will be on cards that support the shared Debit AID from the DNA. Now that we have U.S. Common Debit AIDs on our U.S.-issued debit chip cards, the problem is solved, right? Well, there's just a little more to it than that. When a transaction is initiated by a chip card at a chip-enabled terminal, standard EMV processing dictates that the terminal must determine what AIDs are supported by the chip card and the terminal. Then, a mutually supported AID must be selected for the transaction. This is true not only for POS terminals, but also for ATMs. Although ATM transactions do not fall under Durbin Amendment legislation, ATMs must abide by EMV specifications, and they will be accepting U.S.-issued debit chip cards that support a U.S. Common Debit AID or the Shared Debit AID. When there is more than one AID that is mutually supported between the chip card and the chip-enabled terminal, a choice must be made about which of these AIDs to use for the transaction. The AID may be selected either by the cardholder or by the terminal. With cardholder selection, a brief description of the mutually supported AIDs is presented on the terminal screen, and the cardholder selects one of them. If the terminal does not provide cardholder selection of the AID, then the terminal can either automatically select the AID that has the highest priority on the card as indicated by the issuer, or the terminal can follow custom logic, which allows it to select the AID based on business needs. Note that in the future, if chip cards have AIDs in addition to a standard global AID and a U.S. Common Debit AID, then either cardholder selection or terminal selection by application priority will be used. The terminal cannot override cardholder selection or selection by application priority except in the very specific situation of a debit chip card with a global AID and a U.S. Common Debit AID as the only pair of AIDs present on the chip card. The process described in the EMV Migration Forum's Debit EMV Technical Proposal is an implementation of the third option. This allows for the U.S. Common Debit AID to be selected when it is one of a pair, in other words, where two AIDs point to the same funding source, for example, a single debit account. So, what do U.S. terminals need to do in order to support the U.S. Common Debit AIDs? U.S. terminals need to support the global AIDs for the global payment networks the terminal owner participates in. U.S. terminals also need to support the U.S. Common Debit AIDs for those same global payment networks and U.S. debit networks if routing to unaffiliated debit networks is desired. U.S. terminals may also support the Shared Debit AID from the DNA if the terminal owner participates in any of the DNA member networks. During the interaction between the chip card and the terminal may select either the global AID or the U.S. Common Debit AID when both are supported by the chip card and the terminal, and cardholder AID selection is not provided. Note that U.S.-specific custom logic is required in the terminal in order to facilitate selection by the terminal of a U.S. Common Debit AID over a global AID that has a higher priority. When a U.S. Common Debit AID is selected for a transaction, then the acquirer can route the transaction to any network that the issuer has enabled for that card that supports that AID. This includes the global payment network that licensed the AID, as well as U.S. debit networks that have licensed that AID. Remember, at this time, the Shared Debit AID will be the only AID on a debit network chip card that does not support a global payment network. So, standard EMV application selection by application priority can be used by the terminal in this situation. The terminal should select the Shared Debit AID when it is supported by the chip card and the terminal. There is no conflict between the U.S. Common Debit AIDs offered by the global payment networks and the Shared Debit AID from the DNA, since a U.S.-issued debit chip card should contain only one of these debit AIDs. When the Shared Debit AID from the DNA is selected for a transaction, then the transaction can be routed to any debit network that has licensed the Shared Debit AID and that the issuer has enabled for that card. Now let's look at an online debit transaction involving a contact chip card and a chip-enabled POS device. The concepts that are described here are also relevant to ATMs. The chip card will be inserted into the terminal and must remain there for the duration of the transaction. In our example, we have a U.S.-issued Visa Debit Chip Card with two AIDs, a Global Debit AID and the Visa U.S. Common Debit AID. Our chip-enabled terminal supports numerous AIDs, including the ones listed here. The terminal asks the chip card which AIDs it supports, and the chip card responds with the two AIDs it supports. The terminal then checks its own list to see if it supports either of those AIDs. In this example, the terminal supports both of the AIDs that the chip card supports. If the terminal were to select the Global Visa AID, then the transaction should be routed to a Visa network. Logic must be incorporated into U.S. terminals in order to select a U.S. Common Debit AID over a Global AID that has a higher priority on the chip card. When the U.S. Common Debit AID is selected, the transaction can be routed to any network that supports this AID and that the issuer has enabled for the chip card. This includes Visa networks, as well as U.S. debit networks that have licensed the Visa U.S. Common Debit AID. Details about the U.S.-specific logic that will be needed can be obtained from the terminal vendor. If cardholder AID selection is not provided, the U.S. terminal may select the U.S. Common Debit AID in this situation. It is very important that the AID selected for the transaction is one that both the chip card and the terminal support. The underlying mutually supported application enables the chip card and the terminal to make some processing decisions based on what the chip card and the terminal support. Now, back to our transaction. At this point, the AID to use for the transaction has been selected. The chip card provides some EMV-specific information to the terminal, including an authorization request cryptogram. The terminal formats an authorization request which contains new EMV data elements, including the authorization request cryptogram, and sends the request to the acquirer. The acquirer needs to make a routing decision. The acquirer has to make sure that the network that receives the transaction can support certain choices that were made between the card and the terminal. For example, if no PIN was required for a POS transaction, then the receiving network must be able to carry a transaction that does not contain a PIN. In addition, the acquirer should send the transaction to a network that can carry EMV data. And, as we noted previously, some global payment networks require that if one of their global AIDs was selected for the transaction, then the transaction should be routed to the relevant global payment network. In our example, our acquirer has a choice between a Visa network and a U.S. debit network that has licensed Visa's EMV technology through the U.S. Common Debit AID. Because the terminal selected the Visa U.S. Common Debit AID for our transaction, the transaction can be routed to the U.S. debit network. Eventually, the transaction request will reach the issuer, who must verify the authorization request cryptogram and make an authorization decision. The issuer will generate a response, which may also contain EMV data, such as an authorization response cryptogram. The issuer will send the response to the U.S. debit network, which will deliver it to the acquirer. Any EMV data in the response will be delivered to the terminal, which will pass it to the chip. The chip card and the terminal will once again interact, and the chip card will verify the authorization response cryptogram from the issuer if one was sent. The AID that was used to initiate the transaction does not have an impact on the transaction response. Naturally, each issuer and terminal owner or acquirer will want to test to ensure that the U.S. Common Debit AID or DNA Shared Debit AID is being selected appropriately and transactions are routed as expected. Each of the payment networks and the Debit Network Alliance may have requirements related to certification of these AIDs. Be sure to check with your payment network representatives to obtain their specific requirements and updated certification test plans. We hope this presentation has been helpful. We realize that the concepts presented here are complex. For more information about the topics we have discussed, please refer to any of the sites listed here. The EMV Migration Forum wishes to thank the project team and others who contributed to this presentation. To learn more about the EMV Migration Forum, please contact us. Thank you.